Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, my name is N.S. Abrams. I invite you to this verdant setting that I call my home. My origin began here as a speck many years ago. It was under the aegis of, one could say, nature, that my mind was conditioned, at least I believe so, towards the investigation of nature's secrets, which eventually became a pursuit towards the meaning of life and the meaning of the living being. My predecessors, the ones whom I owe a great debt to, garnered facts and knowledge. Philosophers, scientists, mystics, heroic figures I call them, such as the early Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and innumerable other philosophers, as well as the latter-day scientists such as Planck, Einstein, Bohr, Schrödinger, et al. Last but not least, I pay respect to my late Professor C. Henry, psychobiologist, mathematician, physicist, and one could say scientist extraordinaire. I hasten to chastise myself if I present myself in other than a manner which tries to purvey a difficult study to a lay audience. This is not aimed at college students. It is to edify and impart knowledge contained herein with regard to the science of psychobiophysics. What do we mean by psychobiophysics? Psychobiophysics is, one could say, more than a science. It evaluates the states of consciousness. It seeks to transform objects from the real world outside the mind into ideas. Somehow this harkens to Plato, who said that whatever we think is really a copy of the world. That is, whatever we experience becomes within our minds copies of the world. We say that our only contact with the world fundamentally is through our senses. Sensations, one could say, leads to ideas in the mental field. These ideas are grouped and eventually form what we call representations. Representations can be likened to computer models, where the representation within our minds are equivalent to the actual event or object that gave birth to them. In other words, a representation of a tree or a machine within our minds can contain most of the features that qualifies a tree being a tree or a machine performing as a machine. It should be emphasized that the material herein contained is not going to delve too deeply into biology, psychology, science, mathematics, but rather in an outline form. Originally, I intended to start these lectures in a classical, conventional way, showing how sensation, or the process of physical contact with real objects about us, lead to representations. But I'm sure that within 5 minutes the audience would become drowsy or bored, and I certainly don't want that to happen. Considering this, I shall start with the pair of basic functions. What do we mean by pain? Pain is a state of injury or the result of a harmful action upon any part of the body. The nerves in the immediate vicinity of injury are in a state of alarm, sending distress signals to the brain. Pleasure. What do we mean by pleasure? Pleasure is the opposite state to pain. Excessive pleasure can become painful when it surpasses certain limits. The extreme of pleasure inverts itself into pain. Many degrees of pain, ranging from the unbearable pain of broken bones to the simple ache of sunburn or of a toothache. The mind can also suffer psychic harm or psychological hurt. Abnormal psychology texts are crammed full of case studies of mental injuries and hurts. The loss of parental love, the loss of social status, of friendship, and money are some of the conditions that make up for different states of pains and aches. We can illustrate some examples of physical pain and mental hurt together with their opposites. That is, pleasure or the state of happiness. For instance, contentment, which is a mild physical pleasure, corresponds to the physical pain of irritation. Elation or joy, which is an intense pleasure, can be correlated with the physical pain of depression or sadness. Actually, I should have said mental pain, not physical, because it is actually a combined physical and mental state called depression. Relaxation can be related to its opposite as agitation, and so forth. Love, for instance, dominates the mental field and encompasses, again, both physical and mental pain if it is unrequited. What are we trying to say here? We are saying that pain or unpleasantness versus pleasantness are basic to the human mind. The living being is attracted to conditions that give him happiness, that give him joy and thrills, or any other pleasure, as well as the freedom of bodily movements. On the other hand, we shun objects or retreat from situations which cause pain or can cause pain, and in some instances, even death. Hopefully not. This includes a burning house or walking on a tightrope in a circus, etc. We will not delve into examples of death-defying stunts where the escape from impending injury and even the triumph over death becomes itself a source of thrill to the ego, as well as approval by a fellow man in the form of hero worship. With this brief outline of pain versus pleasure, or unpleasantness versus happiness, we will bring up another pair of principles that go hand in hand with these, and are also basic to the living being, or the internal biomechanisms and the biochemical structures within us. We shall call these functions continuity versus discontinuity. In fact, we will explain the concept of continuity versus discontinuity in the terms of pain and pleasure. We can call pain disagreeability. We can also call pleasure agreeability. Disagreeability, that is pain, and agreeability, pleasure, are, as we have said before, fundamental functions or modes of the mind, and their representations, which are classified according to these two modes, pain versus pleasure, or disagreeability versus agreeability, and are correlated more or less with discontinuity and continuity of our motor reactions. By this I mean continuity resides in any bodily movement that describes itself in an uninterrupted, completed motion. To explain this a little more, any motion involves a continuity of movement, whereas discontinuity is born of inhibition. That is, anything which is inhibitory of this motion. We can explain this another way. Continuity is the property of a movement that describes itself in a completed manner without interruption. We can think of the Earth's rotation as a continuous, of continuous form. We can think of the sunlight as being continuous, as well as life in all its forms upon the earth. Man, however, exhibits discontinuities in his daily life. In fact, we can call his entire life a discontinuity, in the sense it has a beginning and an end. Continuity itself means tending to proceed without interruption. Agreeable impressions are activating in the sense that they urge pleasurably or activate our organic functions. On the other hand, disagreeable impressions hinder these actions because they are inhibitory. The most abstract thought cannot exert itself without awakening a feeling of pain or pleasure within our minds. That is, imperceptibly or not. All representations within our minds that are expressed in a state of consciousness depends, therefore, on these two factors of pain versus pleasure. At this point, I must inform the audience that this is not a mere dull lecture in psychology, physics, or biology. It serves to build a background against which I will demonstrate that the mind is part of the environment that surrounds it and is not isolated from it, but instead it reaches out into it without our even knowing it. The subjective inner world and the outer objective world eventually will be shown as merging one into the other as we find their boundaries arbitrary and elusive assumptions. Self-awareness and self-knowledge will break down these artificial barriers we are all accustomed to. Once the cobwebs of ignorance are swept away, we will be able to peer into nature's secret workshop and observe how the mind was planned out, and will enable us to see how we deal with the harsh, pitiless phenomena that nature besets us with. We will begin to see the faint outlines of future man, the master being of the universe. We shall explore motion and perceptibility as inseparable twins in sensing the objects about us. We shall examine our inner representations of the outer objects that form the reality within our minds, that is, and the categories that we classify as knowledge. We shall study the conscious mind versus the unconscious mind. Eventually, we will develop a picture of the living being relating to the environment that will be understandable by all and will override the usually complicated picture as presented in the college classroom. We will, if some are interested, derive the well-known laws of nature and even Einstein's theories in an alternate manner. We can derive information mathematically showing that gravitational waves have speeds surpassing light, thus accounting for black holes. We will demonstrate that discontinuities, not apparent to our sight, exist in the subnuclear world of the atom. For instance, here we find particles such as quarks and gluons that shuttle back and forth, transferring and stabilizing energy patterns that guarantee coherence to the atom. The emission of energy from the atom takes place as discontinuous photon particles. These grain-like quanta are both discontinuous and instantaneous. The speeds of the discontinuous quarks, gluons, and photons are unimaginable. Therefore, we call them instantaneous. Only the speed of gravitation surpasses them, as well as it surpasses the speed of light. We shall enter at a future time the atomic and subnuclear world armed with the principles of psychobiophysics. We will view space as of continuous form, since any point or locus in space can coincide with its origin. We cannot tell where space begins or where space ends. Time, however, has a discontinuous aspect, since its future cannot coincide with the past in the manner that a point in space can. We shall take up with the science of psychobiophysics by Professor C. Henry that sensations will become ideas. Ideas will congregate to form representations with the aid of motion or movement. The underlying fact that this motion or movement requires energy. Representations are stored in the mind as working models bearing the factor of the motive energy that is latent in them. Now we shall also take up a quick view of the living being. The living being, in the case of man, centers about his mind. Let us first take up the gravitational plane. The gravitational plane makes up the matter that's in the body of the man, or the living being. The electromagnetic plane covers the energy field or energy zone that is necessary to empower the body to engage in motion. The mind, as we have said, before seeks to establish the relationship between the being and its environment. Now, how does it do so? By uniting both the gravitational plane and the electromagnetic plane into one coherent, coordinated structure. And this is a pictorial design of the living being. Here we have it, the mind. Here we have the electromagnetic energy that empowers the body. And here we have the gravitational plane, which comprises matter, since gravity affects all matter. So you've got the design of nature, where the mind and the entire neural system is the equilibrating agent of both planes. Again, this will be taken up at a future lecture. I would like to close this lecture with some passing notes on Professor Henry's theory, as he called it, of objective representations, where the sensing or the sensomotor reactions of the senses as the individual contacts the reality in his environment becomes inner representations of the objects and the events within the mind. And also explains the laws and principles of nature, especially those regarding motion that govern them. These representations, or mental maps as we shall call them in a future lecture, orient ourselves with regard to the many phenomena extant in the universe. They consist of a great many kinds and types, and possess what we would call directionality. Since the diversity of these representations always refer to the same center of biological activity, namely the mind, we can call the mind the psychic unity. We can conveniently place the mind at the center of the biological plane, and we can furnish it with a pointer, much like a compass. This would permit us to govern and regulate its various dealings with the outer world in a circular fashion, that is, transposed in a circular manner. For clarification and for explanation. As we ascend the evolutionary scale, we find that the living being, namely man, develops into more complex structures, and its schemes of operations digresses away from the above simplified circular picture or compass-like diagram. The living or circular being, as we prefer to call it, acts by stopping and changing the direction of its pointer. In other words, as the pointer on the hand or the hand rotates in the biological plane like a compass, it does so either interruptedly or in a continuous manner. That is, in a cyclic form. The more cyclic the rotation, the more continuous it is. The less cyclic, the less continuous, or discontinuous, as we have said before. We can develop this line of thinking and say that the circular being is an ensemble of countless representations by the virtue of the fact that the individual can relate all sorts of phenomenon taking place in the outer world.